Hey everybody, on today's episode of Games with Bill, we're going to talk about an update that's coming to Steam Deck that you're definitely going to want to know about. We also have a game coming from Nintendo sooner than expected. Plus, Microsoft is up to some very shady shenanigans that I think a lot of people are not going to be okay with. And finally, we've got an update to one of my favorite games of all times. If that sounds good, let's get started. Let's start things off talking about the Steam Deck. The Steam Deck is Valve's foray into the world of portable computing. It is essentially a portable gaming PC in the form factor of almost like a Nintendo Switch. It is currently my favorite way to play games. I absolutely love the Steam Deck. It's fantastic. There are things about it, though, that could be better. And YouTuber The Fox, who we actually have had on our podcast On Deck, which is a podcast about the Steam Deck, he was able to use Windows in order to change the refresh rate of the screen of the Steam Deck. Now, this is kind of confusing, and if I get anything wrong, feel free to educate us all in the comment section down below. The refresh rate is how many times per second that the screen updates. Now, I have a lot of screens in my house, and all of them update 60 times per second. There's a lot of other gamers out there who spend a lot of money on better screens than I have that update up to like 240 times per second. I don't have anything that updates that fast, so I don't usually worry about that kind of thing. But he didn't make the screen update faster, he made the screen update slower. And somebody might say, well, why in God's name would you want to make the screen update slower? And that's a really, really good question. Let me explain why you would want to do that. Currently, using SteamOS, there's the button with the three little dots on the bottom right of your Steam Deck, and that's called the Quick Access menu. If you hit the Quick Access menu, it brings up a menu, and you have the ability to tell the Steam Deck to limit how many frames per second that you get when you're playing. Those frames per second could be limited to 60, limited to 30, or limited to 15. Now, those numbers are really, really important. I'll get to why those numbers are important in a moment. Those are the frame rates of the game. Even if you limit your games to run at 15 or 30 frames per second, the screen of the Steam Deck is still going to update at 60 frames per second. So if I limit it to 30 frames per second, I will see every frame twice. That's the way that it works. What the Fox did is he was able to take the refresh rate of the screen using software in Windows down to 40 hertz or 40 times per second. So why would you want to make it update slower? Well, don't get mad at me, but the Steam Deck is fairly underpowered when compared to most PC hardware. It's pretty amazing what you can play on this thing, but it's not a juggernaut of power, and it can't possibly be. It's a portable console that costs $400. It can't be super powerful. And while there are plenty of games that I can play on that run at 60 frames per second, a lot of them will run somewhere between 40 and 50 frames per second. And while that's fine, that's not divisible by 60. If the game is running at 40 frames per second and the refresh rate of the monitor is at 60 frames per second, then you're going to run into some issues. The best way to do it is to have whatever the game is running at be easily or evenly divisible by the refresh rate of the screen. So when the Fox lowered the refresh rate of the screen down to 40, now he can maintain 40 frames per second as your game frame rate, and now you get a really, really smooth experience. Now, of course, he did it using Windows, and I, for one, am not going to be installing Windows on my Steam Deck anytime soon. I prefer to use SteamOS. I think it works fantastically well, and that's okay, because Pierre-Luc Graffai, who works at Valve, he responded to this video. We've been really excited to bring refresh rate switching to Deck to deliver smooth frame pacing in arbitrary FPS limit scenarios. But the current screen blanking time when switching is a bit much. We've been doing work behind the scenes to improve it, coming soon. Now, we don't know what soon means from Valve, but my experience from Valve has been boy, oh boy, do they put out updates really, really quickly. I mean, I think on the latest episode of On Deck, I said that they had updated the keyboard 4 times since the previous episode of On Deck. So within 2 weeks, they did 4 updates just to the keyboard. That means that they have a very fast turnaround time for how they are updating the software of the Steam Deck. So when he says coming soon, I don't know what soon means, but maybe it actually does mean soon, not the soon TM that we're used to from most game developers. So that's really exciting. So when would you want to do this? Well, you would want to do this when you're playing a game that cannot maintain 60 frames per second. And so what you do is you limit the refresh rate of the screen to 40 hertz, and then you limit the frame rate of the game to 40 hertz. And now you have a perfectly silky smooth playing time, which is better than limiting it to 30 hertz because it's 10 more frames per second. So you're getting just a little bit more data that your eyeballs can see, and that makes it feel smoother. I think that this is a really, really important update that we could get in the future, and it's going to do a couple of things. Number one, it'll improve battery life. That's definitely a possibility that we'll have an improve of battery life. Of course, if you don't limit your frame rate, you're not going to have that improvement, but it'll give us the option to improve our battery life. And it will give us more consistent frame rates, which I've always said is far more important than higher frame rates. Having a consistent frame rate is better than a higher frame rate 99.9 times out of 100, in my opinion. If you disagree with me, let me know all the reasons why I'm wrong in the comment section down below. All right, let's move on to Microsoft. There's a lot of games on Xbox that are free to play. There's a lot of games in the gaming industry that are free to play, meaning we can play those games and we don't spend any money. So somebody might wonder, well, how do those companies that make these said games make any money at all if they're free to play? Well, you make money through microtransactions. And microtransactions, they have a bad connotation with them, and I totally understand that. But most microtransactions, in my opinion, are okay. Most of them are like stupid little cosmetics that your character can wear so that you're playing dress up with your friends. And the reason why I'm okay with it is as long as they don't impact gameplay and I can still play the game that I want to play without having to throw extra money at it, then I'm all for it. Especially if this means that a lot of people can play the game and the game can still get, make money for the developers, meaning that they will continue to make games. That's a good thing. So if everybody can play the game for free and it can be supported by the people, the whales, who are spending tons of money playing dress up with their friends, it does not bother me at all as long as it doesn't affect gameplay. But for somebody like me, I'm really not interested in throwing money at a bunch of, dress up stuff, a bunch of cosmetics for my character. And because of that, that means that those free to play games, they don't make any money from me. I am basically costing them money by playing the game. If I log in and play Fortnite using my default skin, I am costing them money. I am a drain on the expenses of that company. So how can they make money? Well, it seems like from this article from Business Insider that Microsoft's plan for free-to-play games is to insert advertisements into the games. And there's a couple of ways that they can do this. And I'm struggling to come up with ways in which they could do this that wouldn't distract or detract from the game itself. So there's been games that have done it before, mostly sports games, where when you're playing the game, let's say I'm watching an actual real person live basketball game. On the side of the court, they usually have like little advertisements that are all over the place. And that's one way that you could advertise in-game that wouldn't feel super intrusive. If you just have the little animations that are happening on the side that say, drink, insert soda of choice here, like that would work. And it wouldn't be very distracting, and honestly, I could probably ignore it. If I can ignore it, how effective is it as an advertising thing? I don't know. Here's the things that I think that they'll probably do, and why I don't want to see that. Number one, lower thirds. I don't know if you guys remember. I mean, I haven't had cable at my house in, I don't know, 12 years or so. We've never, like, I haven't watched commercials on TV in a very, very long time. But I do remember back in the day, you'd be watching a show and up from the bottom would pop like somebody from some other show, and they'd be like walking around on the screen and waving at each other and doing some stupid hijinks, and it would say, watch this show on Mondays at 10 a.m. or something, you know, that kind of thing. It would show up for a second and then it would go away, but it would take you out of the show that you're watching. And I always despised that. And if they did that in a video game, I would really hate that. If we had like a little pop-up in the, you know, in a corner of the screen where they don't have a lot of UI elements, and they would have a pop-up that would show up and be like, hey, make sure that you eat Taco Bell or whatever. That would be distracting and terrible. And I would not want that. Another way that they could do advertising in games would be during loading screens. But loading screens are very, very problematic. Like, I have a pretty decent computer and I have an SSD in my computer, and so my computer might load a game really fast. And your computer might load a game slower than mine. That means that you see the advertisement on a loading screen longer than I see the advertisement on a loading screen. And I don't know that I trust publishers enough for them to not say, let's artificially slow this loading screen down in order to make sure that every user of our game gets at least this much time on the loading screen so that they can see that advertisement. Because the longer that an advertisement goes on for, the more effective it probably is. Of course, I'm sure that there's a drop-off, and they've done tons and tons of research on that, but I'm guessing that a 30-second advertisement is probably a little more effective than a 2-second advertisement. And I don't know that I trust publishers to not try and maximize the amount of time that I'm looking at ads in their game. So that's something that I don't want to see. I'm going to use this to segue into the fourth story. We're going to go back to the third story in a minute. But the fourth story is that Sega recently announced that they are possibly working on a big budget modern version of Crazy Taxi. And I could see in-game advertisements working very well in a game like that would not be any of these obtrusive things that I just talked about. First off, let's say that Sega makes this big budget Crazy Taxi and they make the game a free-to-play game. And it's a free-to-play game, but also has a single-player option, but it also has a multiplayer option. And that multiplayer option takes 100 people to drive around the city collecting fares. And I pull up to the curb and somebody gets into my taxi and they're like, hey, take me to, and then there's a little space where they sell the ad. Take me to Pizza Hut, take me to Taco Bell, take me to Tower Records. Probably not Tower Records, they don't exist anymore. Take me to the Apple Store. You know, they have that as the advertisement. And then I just drive through the city and I deliver them to the location that was then advertised to me. So I pick up somebody, I get like, take me to the Apple Store. You pick up somebody and it's take me to Best Buy. And that's because, you know, different advertisers paid for different regions or something like that. I don't know. I think overall, that would be fairly innocuous, not distracting. I don't know how effective that advertisement would be, but it might work okay. And that's the kind of advertisement that I think would be unobtrusive enough that it would work. So this Crazy Taxi could be free to play, but monetized through those advertisements. Of course, it could monetize in other ways by, I mean, one of the things that I loved about Crazy Taxi was listening to that awesome soundtrack of The Offspring playing on my Dreamcast. I loved that soundtrack. It would be really cool if I could buy music to listen to in my taxi. I don't know that I would want to do that. I would probably just play my own music from my phone while I'm driving around, but there's a lot of people who spend money on in-game music, and that could be another way to monetize. And of course, you could monetize by changing how your car looks or changing the color of the costumes that your character is wearing. There's a lot of ways that you can monetize that game that would make it profitable for a free-to-play audience. And one of those ways could be advertisements. And I think those advertisements are fine. But the loading screen advertisements or the advertisements that are popping up on the bottom of the screen, that's bad because it detracts from the game or distracts from the game. And it kind of takes you out of the game. And it's not like Crazy Taxi is this amazing narrative experience, but you don't want to be taken out of the game when you're playing. All right, let's move on to the final story of the show, and that is Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Before I mention anything about Xenoblade Chronicles 3, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you. All right, Xenoblade Chronicles 3. I love the Xenoblade series. Xenoblade Chronicles 1 was really great. Not a lot of people really got a hold of that game. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was unbelievably fantastic. Xenoblade Chronicles X was very good, but nobody played it because it was on the Wii U. I'm still waiting for a Switch port of that game. But Xenoblade Chronicles 3 was announced at I think it was at the most recent Nintendo Direct. I believe it was. And it was announced to come out in September. Well, guess what? It's not coming out in September. And most of the time people would say, okay, well, it's not coming out in September, so that means it's getting a delay. That's not the case. It's coming out in July. And I'm very excited about this. Now, why would they move it up? And the conspiracy theorist in my brain says that their big game, that their tentpole summer game that they were going to have was Breath of the Wild 2. And they were going to have E3. I mean, E3's canceled. If you didn't know about that, go back and check out the episode where I talk about that. But even the digital version of E3 is canceled. But let's pretend to live in a world where that didn't happen. E3's not canceled. Nintendo is going to deliver on Breath of the Wild 2 this year, like they said that they would. And they do their Nintendo Direct. They announced the name of Breath of the Wild 2, which is Ganon's Revenge or something, I don't know. And then they say, and by the way, you can play it next month in July. E3's in June, next month in July. People would go nuts. There would be a bunch of people typing on the internet saying, Nintendo just won E3, like that kind of thing, as if it's a competition. We don't live in that world, because E3 has been canceled, and Nintendo has told us that Breath of the Wild 2 has been delayed until spring of next year. Well, if that's the case, then the next best thing would be to bring in Advance Wars 1 and 2 and have that release. Well, that got delayed because of everything that's been happening in the Ukraine. And if you didn't know about that, go back and watch the episode where I talk about that. So what do? They take Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which I think that there's a lot of overlap between Zelda fans and Xenoblade fans, and you drop that in the middle of the summer to kind of prop up everything that's happening. Now, maybe none of this is true. Maybe Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is just doing better than they thought, and they decided to release it early. But what my guess is that Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has either been done or close to done for a while now, and the reason it was coming out in September is not because that's when it was going to be finished, but instead because that's when it made the most sense to release it. And I'm going to give you an example. Right now, Marvel has a ton of movies that are done. All of the movie studios have a ton of movies that are done. Why? Because they didn't release a bunch of movies during the pandemic because movie theaters were closed. And do they release all of those movies at the same time? No. Nobody wants to release their next movie on the same weekend as, say, the new Doctor Strange movie. That competition is going to kill that other movie. that would be bad for the studio that releases that other movie. So they want to be more strategic about when they release their movies. And by the way, if you want to see a movie-related channel, let me know. Anyway, moving on. I think it makes a lot of sense that game studios do the same exact thing. They say, all right, well, we'll release this game at this point, and, you know, probably people will be playing that game a lot for the next couple of months, and so we want to have something to land right at that couple of months point in order to keep the momentum going. Because otherwise, if you release like 2 games at the same time, they compete with each other, and that hurts sales. So I do think that video game companies are fairly strategic, and especially big companies like Nintendo that release many games in a year, they have to be extra strategic about when they release their games. So I think a lot of times the games are done well before they are released, and they hold on to them until it's strategically the best fiscal move for them to do. And I think that that's what they were doing with Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and that's why we're going to get it in the summer. I will say this, it's a day one buy for me. Xenoblade Chronicles is awesome, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is awesome, and I fully expect Xenoblade Chronicles 3 to be awesome. And Nintendo, release Xenoblade Chronicles X on the Switch, because I want to play it. Alright, that's it for today's episode of Games with Bill. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you sat through the whole thing, then make sure you click on that thumbs up button before you get out of here. And of course, thank you for watching. Stay awesome, everybody, and watch this video right here.